So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good day, everyone, and welcome to our Monday call of ELNET and Friends of ELNET. Today, our focus is on the Israel Survey 2025, a longitudinal research project ELNET is conducting for many years. And earlier this year, we published for the first time a long-term study focused on the years of 2022 until 2025. It's my pleasure to have our good friend, our expert, also an ELNET fellow, Professor Dr. Shlomo Shpiro from Bar-Ilan University, today with us on this call. Shlomo is actually in Berlin. He just arrived earlier today from Israel, I heard. So it will be a close and intimate discussion. And of course, we are looking for some interactions also from your side. The idea for this call is we will introduce the key findings of the research project we have and the implications for Europe-Israel relations and specifically for the work of ELNET. And Shlomo Shpiro is also the academic partner for this survey for many years, which is why he is the best expert to discuss the findings with us. Just to give you an overview, and these slides will be available for download and to share afterwards what this project is about. For many years, we are serving on an annual basis members of various European parliaments, including the European Parliament. In total, this analysis includes 4 waves from 4 different years from over 35 European countries. In total, more than 1,000 participants. Of course, it has also its limits. It is not representative for all over Europe, but it gives us strong indications if we consolidate the data into party families or into regions. And just before we start with the conversation, just some key findings at a glance to give you some food for thought to begin with. 68% of European members of parliament want more cooperation with Israel. 57% prioritize defense, and 75% view anti-Semitism as a serious problem. And just before you ask, a bit less than half of the MPs that participated in our survey have never been to Israel. And also, approximately 50% of the MPs who participated are not very familiar with the work of ELNET. So it's not only our alumni who participated here and maybe provided favorable from their point of view answers, but it's a serious survey that gives us a lot of insights into European perspectives. So, Shlomo, without further ado, let's start with our conversation. First of all, it's again great to have you here. Given the highly dynamic and escalating situation in the Middle East, it's wonderful that you made it to Berlin, but maybe you could give us some assessment of the immediate security threats on the ground right now.
Well, the war has entered its 3rd week, and I think that we see two developments. First of all, we see the first time that the US and Israel are actively fighting a war together. We didn't have this in history. We had a lot of US support in previous conflicts and previous wars, but to fight a war together is completely different. And it means that you have to integrate command structures together. It means that Israeli planes are flying missions with American planes. It means that ships talk to other naval ships, that headquarters are sitting in each other's headquarters, representatives, and fighting the war on a minute-to-minute basis. These are not big political decisions in which somebody sits in the White House and somebody sits in Jerusalem and say, well, the next week we're going to do this or that and the other. The whole issue, for example, of detection of Iranian missiles, you have about 6 to 8 minutes to detect an incoming missile into Israel. And by working together, by integrating US and Israeli systems, this saves lives all over the region, not just in Israel and US lives, but also in Qatar and in Dubai and in Abu Dhabi, in Iraq, even in Azerbaijan, in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia. So I think this is an amazing development on the one side. On the other side, this is going to be for the long run. This war is not going to be over in a few days. It's not really only a political decision. There are more decisions on the ground. So I think that the issue of air defense resupplies is very important. International diplomatic backing for the military operations is very important. But so far, I'm happy to say the Israeli public has shown a very high level of resilience. And maybe it's just after 2.5 years of constant wars, people don't seem to be so much worried about it anymore. They take it in their stride. I look at children in Israel, I've asked my nephew, he's 11. I said, well, what do you do in school when there is an alarm? And he said to me, Uncle Shlomo, I'm an expert at alarms. We've already had 11 of them. So, I'm proud of my family expertise. And that's how ordinary people react. It's a difficult price to pay, but it's going to go on for a number of weeks. And we have to have strong resilience in the US public as well.
Couldn't agree more. And let me say, it shouldn't be that way for sure. In general, and in particular, not for children, but it's amazing to see how they react, how they deal with it. I will do some deep dives on the initial comments you just made, but maybe to start with, also in this polarized world, we all know ELNET is bridging the gap between Europe and the European perceptions, European politicians, and Israel already, well, almost for 20 years actually. But what do you think? Why is Europe needed and important for Israel right now, maybe more than ever?
Europe is extremely important to Israel, and the relations between Europe and Israel are a key foundation for Israeli foreign policy. Because Europe is comprised of so many different countries, a lot of Israelis tend to kind of look down at Europe as a political mechanism and say, well, we don't need Europe. They can come looking for us when they need us. This couldn't be more wrong. Over the past 15 years, Europe has become Israel's biggest trading partner. So in terms of the economy, the relations to Europe is very, very important. The relations not only in purely economic numbers, but also in innovation, in development, in cooperation with European firms. You hardly find today a European defense company that doesn't work very closely with Israeli partners. And this wouldn't have been the case. That they would have been competing with each other 10 years ago. Today, they're working with each other to provide real world solutions to the threats we see all the time. All you have to do is stand outside your house in Jerusalem, look up, and you see the missiles coming in and being intercepted. And you see that technologies which once were thought of as absolute space fiction, and I believe probably there's one or two participants who are as old as I am, and I am about the same age as Methuselah, who remember President Reagan and his Star Wars. Well, at that time, people said, come on, this is not serious. How can you fire a missile that's going to hit another missile in space? And the technologies were not ripe for that. But today we see this is an everyday reality. And Europe is very important for Israel in economic terms, not to mention, of course, for historical terms, the cultural sense, and very importantly, shared values. We share values with Europeans. Many Israelis come from Europe. And we share values, and this is not something that's going to go away after 1 year or one war or one conflict. So Europe is very important, and I'm very happy that I can speak today to such a distinguished audience. Actually, this is my second time giving a briefing to ELNET, the Friends of ELNET in the US, and thank you very much for inviting me.
With pleasure, Shlomo, for sure. And what you said about Star Wars, when I think about Star Wars, it's more George Lucas that comes into my mind and less Ronald Reagan, but maybe that shows I'm a younger generation, nonetheless familiar with the term. Okay, so against the background of what you just said, I mean, if we listen to some European politicians, in particular from Spain, but also from other European countries, I understand that some people raised the concern or raised the question if Europe is lost when it comes to Israel. You just basically said the opposite. And if I look into the results of our Israel survey over the years, not only the last and most current results, also the numbers speak a different language. And before we go into the details of the survey, and we just picked some for the audience today, where we discussed it before and where we think they are, where we believe that they are the most interesting findings. But from your personal point of view, Shlomo, what is the single most surprising finding in the Israel survey 2025?
I think I have two takes on that. The first is clearly waking up to the security realities of the threats to Europe. In the early surveys, a lot of parliamentarians in Europe spoke about soft power. They spoke about climate change and cultural exchange, and things that are easy to agree on. Of course, everybody wants to have a nice climate and a nice cultural exchange. These are easy things. There has been over the years a move to hardcore politics and hardcore security issues. This is definitely something that started with the Ukraine war. Europeans woke up suddenly to the reality that their comfortable and quiet life was not as safe as they believed it to be forever. And we see it with the war with Iran now. Suddenly everybody's interested in Israeli technologies, not because they like Israel. It's interesting to note that the two most anti-Israeli states in Europe are actually running for Israel to buy security technologies. And especially I refer to Spain and Ireland also, but other countries as well. We are obviously good enough for them to protect them, but not good enough to be friends. We can't give up on Europe, and I see that the work of ELNET is so important in raising the right issues, in asking the right questions. It's not only of providing answers, it's first of all asking the right questions.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for that. So you already mentioned that Europe is more focused on hard power and less in soft power when it comes to the relations with Israel. And I just want to highlight this with the findings from our survey that we see that in particular, defense and counterterrorism dominate now the rating of topics when we ask parliamentarians from all across Europe among the most relevant ones. So would you say Europe is finally, but slowly but finally, waking up to harsh realities? Is it the Zeitenwende that drives Europe more to these hard topics? What's your take on this?
If you look at European security, at least of the last 1,000 years, it is a long list of conflicts and wars. And the European Union, the idea of a European integration from the 1950s, was an idea to overcome these wars and to create, for the first time, a European community in which people will work for the welfare of themselves and of others and to prevent war. And this is a great model, and this has worked very well. It's a bit similar to the federalism in the United States. It's sometimes very difficult when you travel in the US, if you're in Florida and a week later in South Dakota, to find what is common among the people there. But what is common is that they feel American and that they know, and it could be different things, but they know what is good for America. That's how they define themselves. And this is the development in Europe. But Europeans woke up after Russia invaded Ukraine, and this nice new world was under threat. Everybody in Europe neglected security. Just take a look at what's happening with the British. And I think President Trump has made a point of relating to that. When the British base in Cyprus was attacked 10 days ago by Iran and by the Hezbollah, the British couldn't send a single ship to the protection of their own sovereign base. I mean, we're talking about Great Britain, which is not so great anymore. They used to have a navy of 600 ships. Today, they couldn't get one at sea for about a week. This is not because of any neglect or stupidity. It's because the feeling over last decades in Europe was we don't need to worry about our security because the US provides our security. And they see the US engaged in many parts of the world, not only in the Middle East. And they have the Ukraine war, which has been going on and on and on and absorbing. I read amazing statistics. 10% of the world's munitions production is absorbed by the Ukraine war. So more and more Europeans understand that Israel is the front line of Western defense. And Israelis shed their blood, not only for themselves, but for Western values. I think this has come through in the survey of the last year stronger than ever before. And now I would say that next year's survey, which will certainly be influenced by the war with Iran, is we're going to see these trends even more reinforced.
Speaking about Iran, we see indeed a sharp increase, a sharp change when it comes to the question which country or institution is the biggest security threat for Europe. So Russia already was number one, comparing now the numbers from 24 to 25, and it further grew. But and you just mentioned, I think by accident, that you started saying that Russia invaded Europe, but you wanted to speak about Ukraine. But you're absolutely right. I mean, Europe is Ukraine, and Ukraine is Europe, and we shall never forget that Russia indeed invaded, even though it's not a NATO member, it's not an EU member, but the Ukraine, the independent Ukraine as a country, as a nation, is part of Europe for sure. So, and I think I couldn't agree more also with your description that the alliance between Iran and Russia indeed led to a threat perception in Europe, and we see here this sharp increase. How European members of parliament feel about Iran from almost 13 percentage points to 43. So if we speak about this threat perception, how crucial is Israeli defense technology from your point of view for the actual survival and protection of European soil today, in particular in the light of the current war against Iran?
Many European politicians are realists. They may have a weak, soft spot for Israel for historical or religious or cultural reasons, but they are mainly realists. And politicians are there, first and foremost, to provide security for their own countries. And they look around at what works, and they look around at what is a threat. Now, both Russia and Iran are using similar, sometimes identical technologies. In fact, Iran supplied most of the drones used by Russia during the war with Ukraine. So the same drones that fly against civilians in Kiev are the drones that fly against civilians in Tel Aviv. But now they also fly against civilians in Riyadh, in Dubai, in Amman, and everywhere else. I think the biggest mistake that Iran made, and I could not believe they would do it, but they did it, is attack all the Sunni Arab states around them, a whole crescent of countries which really did their best over the last decades to remain outside the instability of the Middle East. And I refer to countries like Dubai, like Abu Dhabi, like Qatar, and like Bahrain, which are in the Middle East, but they were not involved in the conflicts. What on earth made the Iranians attack them? Maybe maybe the thought that by attacking these countries they would put pressure on the U.S. This was just not going to work. They have completely alienated the region that they are within, and they brought up the old rift, the religious rift between Sunnis and Shias. We should remember that Iranians hate the Sunni Arabs more than they hate us. And they show it. We see the missiles falling on Dubai airport, and everybody who had a flight canceled because they flew from Australia to London, or from New Orleans to Bombay. And they had they were victims of this conflict. So I think that the answer is everyone is looking at Israel and the US, because many of these technologies were developed jointly. And Europeans, in all realism, want to defend their countries from the next threat. And that will be now a very, very strong element in European foreign policy.
Right. So speaking about European foreign policy, and we all know how complex it is, ultimately, after of discussion, and ELNET has always been part of this, advocating exactly for a stronger stance on the IRGC. We saw some changes last year, and obviously now with the ongoing war against the Mullah regime and its Revolutionary Guards Corps, we see that Israel and the US together are taking action. So just looking at the Israel survey, I find this number still staggering from, well, we collected the numbers the votes last year, and again, we published them earlier this year, and we asked European MPs if the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, should be classified as a terrorist organization. 92% of the participating MPs agreed and said yes. So that was before the European Union decided to do so. But given the ongoing war, what do you think? How valuable, how relevant is this EU Parliament's decision in the effects now of the war and its aftermath?
The decision of the European Parliament to list the Iranian Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization is extremely important because the Iranians have used Europe as a logistical base, as a financial base. They were able to openly collect money, to move their people about, to build up front organizations. And now, after years of advocacy and activity, finally, the European Parliament has made this organization illegal. I am not surprised that 92% of members of parliament voted to list it as a terror organization. I'm surprised about the other 8% who think that this Iranian global terrorist organization should not be criminalized. I don't know where they're living, but you just have to see what is happening in Europe and all over the world through the Iranian fronts, through the terrorist organizations. We don't want children to be in threat, and not just Jewish children, but everywhere. When I look at Michigan, and I look at the attack in Michigan, which was really by miracle prevented or stopped by the brave security guards at the synagogue and the Jewish Educational Center there. But not every center is so well protected with trained people. Every Jew, and certainly in Europe, is a target. Synagogues look like fortresses. In Europe, you pass through by a synagogue and it looks like a fortress with bulletproof windows, with fences, with policemen with submachine guns standing outside. It shouldn't be like that. There's not a single church that is guarded by policemen, certainly not a single mosque. But why should every Jewish school and every Jewish synagogue be turned into a fortress? Why? Because of these people, because they make us into targets, and we have no other possibility but to defend ourselves.
Thank you so much. So in other words, all the work also ELNET and for sure also others did finally paid off because now the IRGC are listed as a terrorist organization across the European Union, and member countries can now take a stronger stance based on this legal decision by the European Parliament. So yes, it has been a longer way, and in Europe, very often things take longer, but I think it's worse because the results count at the end. Let's speak about other results. And before we open also for questions from our audience, and by having said that, please all feel invited. If you have questions, type them in the chat so we can pick them up later. Shlomo, I mentioned at the beginning, there is a clear mandate, even in 2025, despite all the ongoing efforts, despite all the noise from far left, far right, or other extremist groups across Europe, a clear mandate. 68% of European members of parliament call for closer cooperation with Israel, not for less. And here on this slide, we see the development since 2022. So it's also good to reflect before and like prior and after October 7, how the willingness to cooperate in Europe on the one hand changed and yes, declined, but nonetheless remains strong and stable over the years. So Given, Shlomo, that the majority of European members of parliament still clearly mandates action to more cooperation, where do you see the greatest immediate potential for joint Europe-Israel projects?
Cooperation comes first and foremost out of needs. And the needs of European politicians are now to provide security. It's a bit sad because Israel is, I think, today the fourth largest defense exporter in the world. We don't want to be that. You know, we want to be a country that exports flowers and ideals and perhaps other very, very positive things. We don't want to sell guns, but we are forced to, and it's a fact, whether you want it or not. It's a fact that the attention of Europeans is going to be focused in the coming years on defense. And this is where the biggest potential for cooperation is. I participated last year in a meeting of the ELNET Security and Defense Initiative in Berlin. There were representatives of all the major defense contractors around Europe. They all came not because Israelis are nice and have blue eyes or whatever. They came because the technologies developed by Israel work. And some of their own technologies, not necessarily. They know that what is offered is never perfect. Realism is never perfect, but it works. I have read the statistics about Iranian missiles attacks against Israel. As of today, around lunchtime, about 310 ballistic missiles were fired at Israel. The huge majority of them were intercepted. Some of the parts are falling on people. Unfortunately, people are killed and houses are destroyed and cars and so on, but most of them do not. Tel Aviv would have looked completely different if these 310 missiles would have fallen and exploded. So thanks to the visionary ideas of a small group of people 20 years ago, ballistic missile defense, this is what's saving Israel. And I think it's saving the Middle East, because if Tel Aviv would have looked like Gaza, then Tehran would have looked worse. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Very clear answer. So indeed, for those of you who are not yet familiar with the ELNET Security and Defense Initiative, ESDI, that Professor Shpiro just mentioned, please have a look at the global website. There is a dedicated section where you can find our recent papers, for example, on drones and counter drones. The next roundtable will be on maritime security. So there is a lot of things going on, a lot of papers being written, a lot of people, stakeholders from Europe and Israel that are connected on ELNET's latest initiative, the ESDI. So, Shlomo, you are, among other things, an expert on NATO. It was already years ago, I think, your first paper that you wrote for ELNET that was indeed on NATO-Israel relations, the question of more or less cooperation. And also here, and this is the last question that we have before we open for questions from the audience, questions and remarks, of course. We also, for a number of years, asked members of European parliaments what their take is on Israel-NATO relations. And I find it really interesting and even surprising that 74% of European lawmakers actually want closer relations between Israel and NATO, probably for the reasons that you just mentioned. Nonetheless, NATO, some may say it's brain dead. No, I think it's alive and kicking, and we see it growing and strengthening, in particular in these days. So I wonder, what is your take on these numbers, the development that we see here in Europe, that even European members of European Parliament now call for a NATO membership of Israel? I think something that you suggested as a potential scenario in your visionary paper 3 or 4 years ago. So what is the potential direction where NATO-Israel cooperation could look like, could head for in the upcoming years, given the geopolitical roadblocks we face?
Thank you very much, Carsten, because that is a very important question. And I've been dealing with Israel-NATO relations for 31 years. I think that people very often overlook, first of all, the existing relations. There's a whole range of cooperation initiatives that go on behind the scenes, and some are already quite a few years old, between NATO and Israel. But, and let us not make any mistakes here, the one barrier to the integration of Israel in NATO or to closer cooperation is Turkey. Turkey is a full member of NATO and has a veto right in all the important committees of NATO. And they regularly block initiatives that include Israel. This is a policy of Turkey for more than a decade to try and stop everything that may benefit Israel in terms of NATO. Now, what can we do together? The potential is huge. For example, in the field of logistics, both Israel and NATO member countries use the same planes, the same type of artillery, very similar tanks. All these require huge logistical facilities. The same planes that Israel uses, Britain and Germany and the Netherlands now and Denmark bought, if they could be resupplied, if they could be worked together in the same facilities, there would be savings in billions. Imagine every train company would need to have its own depot for the locks. If they could share one depot for all the similar locks, they would save a lot. This is one field for working with NATO. Intelligence sharing and early warning systems. Israel does it very effectively with the Americans, but with very, very few other NATO countries. So Turkey is a blockage there. I hope that there will be some way to overcome that. It's still very, very problematic, but I see a lot of potential there. But we have to remember, NATO is not the solution to everything. And I think many people in the US realize it now. When President Trump is asking for assistance from the European NATO members for sending naval forces to the Straits of Hormuz, they are dragging their feet. And frankly, they will kill the Iranians by discussions. I don't see any serious European force from NATO countries arriving in the Straits of Hormuz anytime soon. They will talk, they will debate, they will discuss it, and they will formulate, as they always do, a security strategy or a security architecture. That's a term that NATO loves, security architecture, which basically means you don't need to do anything until others do it, and then it's far too late. So NATO, very, very good, but it's got its limitations. You can't rely on NATO for your own security.
Very well said, Shlomo. Thank you so much so far. That has been a ride through the, from our point of view, most interesting findings from the Israel Survey 2025. We could discuss many more of the findings from the survey. Please, for those of you who would like to have a closer look on the full survey, and yes, we can share and we'll share the slides after this call. But please also have a look at the ELNET Global website, and the Israel survey is available for download there for your convenience. We have the first question already from Larry Hochberg, Shlomo, and it is also connected with some of the questions, or with in particular one of the questions we have in our survey. This is about Islamist groups in Europe. So do you see that there is a growing concern in Europe regarding these Islamist groups? And B, do you see that Europe is politically united how to deal with Islamism in Europe?
Let's start from the easy part, which is the second question. And the answer is very simply no. Europe has no common policy on how to deal with deeply rooted Islamic anti-Semitism. I think that most Muslims in Europe are not anti-Semitic. They came to Europe for wish of a better life, better financial conditions, or to save themselves from very, very unstable countries. But there are the radicals, and Europe doesn't know how to deal with them. And many European politicians prefer the soft approach. That means all kinds of de-radicalization programs and social programs. They're all very important, very, very important. But who is going to stop the terrorist who's driving the SUV into the gate of the synagogue? And I'm not just thinking about the attack that happened several years ago in Michigan, but I'm thinking about Yom Kippur and the terrorist attack in the synagogue in Manchester, where you have a radicalized local Muslim terrorist who drives into and over the people in the synagogue and tries to kill as many as they can. Who is going to stop him? A de-radicalization program? No. Some leaflets given out at city centers? I'm sorry, but probably not either. So we have to see more action and maybe less words. And more action is not just to harden the targets of Jewish communities. It's the other side. It's prevention. These guys don't need to be able to get the guns and to come to the synagogue. If the terrorists reach the synagogue, you have failed. You as a country have failed. Your law enforcement, your intelligence services have failed. Who saved the children in Michigan? Those security guards at the synagogue, as they did also in Manchester and other places. Only in the last 2 weeks, we had bombings of synagogues in Norway, in Belgium, in France, and in the Netherlands and other places. Just by miracles, people were not killed. So there is no joint European action in terms of law enforcement and in terms of intelligence. Yes, there are a lot of very, very nice and good programs for de-radicalization and talking about radicalization. But if this happens, then these programs have failed.
Yep, couldn't agree more. And I mean, one of these smaller projects in Europe, but highly relevant, of course, is one of ELNET's projects with the Fragemauer, the question wall, literally translated, which is an educational campaign. So it is part of the prevention mix that we have in Europe, and already running the Fragemauer, our project now in 2 countries. So let's maybe add, and again, please, all of you feel welcome to add your thoughts, questions to Shlomo regarding the Israel survey, or also if it's beyond the Israel survey, please type it in the chat. Shlomo, we also focused some of the questions of the Israel survey already for many years on anti-Semitism, in particular Israel-related anti-Semitism. And we see that there is indeed a development that the number has jumped. So from 15% of European MPs in 2022 who agreed that Israel-related anti-Semitism is an issue, this number increased from 15 to 35% last year. So while we see this on the one hand, on the other hand, we see, as you just described it, with the focus on Islamism, we also see it when it comes how to deal with anti-Semitism and Israel-related anti-Semitism. In some of the countries, in particular in Western and Northern Europe, we have far higher approval rates among MPs, 40 to 50% who say, yes, it's a severe problem. In Central and Southern Europe, it's far less. And in particular, in left-wing parties or members of left-wing parties, we can report substantially lower concerns compared to conservatives or liberals. So do you think that this political fragmentation, and it's sometimes even across countries, but this political fragmentation is a challenge, is a burden on the mission to fight anti-Semitism?
I think one of the main problems is an apologetic approach towards anti-Semitism. And the usual excuse is of people, we're not anti-Semitic, we're anti-Israeli. And they say, well, being anti-Israeli is legitimate, being anti-Semitic is not nice. It's very, very difficult to differentiate the rabid anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism that one experiences in a number of countries in Europe now. It's not the kind of anti-Semitism of people going around saying, well, the Jews have crucified Christ. Yeah? It's much more political, it's much more social, but it also points a finger at Jews in these countries as being kind of Israelis or Israeli agents or aliens or not belonging to society. And unfortunately, this echoes, at least in my ears, this echoes what we heard in the 1920s and 30s. Well, the Jews don't really belong here. Yeah, okay, we may tolerate them and we may protect them, but they are not part of us. That is a core issue. If you see the Jew in singular, many people say the Jew, not Jews in plural. If you see the Jew as being different, as being someone whose loyalties are to somewhere else, then it's not anymore part of your society. You may tolerate him, you may do a favor and put a policeman by the door of the synagogue or something like that. But this is a very, very deep issue of even parties in Europe, and certainly some social movements, radical social movements, that delegitimize Jewishness in Europe, even by saying, well, Zionism says that all Jews should go to Israel, so they should all go to Israel, and get out of here. These are the usual excuses of extremists, and this is a problem that starts with tolerating it by politicians, and I have to say also tolerating it by the courts, because many times when law enforcement already catches these radicals and bring them to court, we sometimes see a very lenient approach in a number of European countries towards these anti-Semitic crimes, with judges saying, well, he hasn't actually killed anyone. He just wanted to, or spoke about it, or wrote about it, or planned it, but he hasn't actually killed anyone. So it's not a big deal. Well, it is a big deal, because the end of the tip of the spear is when they actually carry out these activities. There is a huge way to go with anti-Semitism, and I think the work that ELNET does is absolutely important here. Other organizations as well. We don't want just to be a defensive nation living in fortresses, and recently I've noticed that I travel a lot around in Europe. It's not just synagogues and Jewish schools that became fortresses. Unfortunately, it's very often people's homes. People now install cameras and windows, bars on the windows and what have you, and all kinds of security. We don't want to be a nation of fortresses. We want to be a nation of openness, which we have always been. But there's a lot more to be done, eliminating this leniency towards anti-Semitism.
Very well said. Recently, I read a study by the Federal Criminal Police here in Germany that reads that almost every second Muslim in Germany shows attitudes of radicalization. So we don't see it yet in political parties. There is no, at least in Germany, no Muslim voting bloc, no Muslim party yet. In other countries, we see these tendencies. So what's your take on this? On the one hand, on the political level, will we see a growing number of Muslim, maybe even Islamist parties across Europe? And B, how, from your point of view, should Europe deal with this growing number of potential extremism, potential Islamism across Europe?
If we look at waves of migration, and the US is an excellent example in the late 19th and early 20th century, we see the first generation of migrants. They are busy with survival. They want to make it economically for their own family. They want to make it in the new world or the new country. They work very hard so that their children have better education, better living conditions, better chances than they had in the countries they left. The second generation, they are already doing quite well. They're building upon the success of that first generation. A lot more opportunities are open to them. And the second, and certainly the third generation, become very active politically. Is there in the US an Irish party? Well, there's a huge Irish minority, and they're very active in various ways, but there's no Irish party. But we have seen their support for Irish nationalism in the 70s and 80s in collecting money and arms for the IRA and examples like that. Is there a Greek party in the US? There's a huge amount of migrants in the US who originally came from Greece. And some of them are concerned about the politics and back in the home country, but many of them are not. Was there ever a Jewish party in the US? You can argue about that. I do think that Muslim migrants in Europe will be more involved politically. We see it now in Britain. We see the Green vote in Britain go into constituencies where there is a large number of Muslims there. I think most European countries are not there yet, but that's something that in the long term will affect politics, because the second generation, the first generation may not have the voting right or may not have the citizenship, but the second certainly do. And politicians look at that. And I've only read today about an interview with the former German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, who said how much she objects to the AfD, to the right-wing AfD party, and how this affected her decision-making over migration. So this is certainly something that's going to change European identities over the next decade.
Very interesting insights. Thank you, Shlomo. Let's move before we close back to geopolitics for 2 or 3 more minutes. So we saw earlier today on this call that there is a shift in Europe to more defense-oriented topics, more willingness to collaborate on defense and security issues with Israel. So given the fact that we are strongly supported and generously supported by many US Americans, some of them are on the call today. So where do you see how much could this development that we find with the Israel survey also have an impact on the broader US, Israel, Europe strategic triangle?
I think it's absolutely important, because the people who participated in the survey and the people who are participating in ELNET activities or come to Israel as part of ELNET delegations or liaise with ELNET in any way, shape, or form are the people who make decisions. Politicians are the people who make decisions, not just heads of state. Heads of state deal with the global issues. But these parliamentarians, they are so important because they sit in the committees, they sit in the party political discussions, they sit behind the scenes, and they have a vote. They raise their hand. And if they raise their hand for Israel, then we have succeeded. And if they don't, and it's very easy to abstain, then we have failed. And if they are against, they are against. But we know that parliamentarism in a democracy can rise and fall on one vote. In fact, historically, many of the important things relating to Israel were either approved or rejected by one vote. I can think of 2 examples. The reparations agreement between Germany and Israel in the early 50s went through the German parliament with a majority of a single vote. One vote. This was the Chancellor, Adenauer, at the time. And the Israeli-Egyptian peace accord, which is such a fundamental base for Israeli regional policy, was also, I think, by 1 or 2 votes approved. So these parliamentarians are the people to hit, absolutely to get, to provide information through the survey and others. They're the people who sit and make decisions. It's just that, and we see in the survey, and that is amazing for me every year to see this, how pro-Israelis these parliamentarians become if they actually visit Israel. All it has to do, it's a difference of 10 or 11%. One visit to Israel makes a difference. And there's nothing like sitting in Jerusalem at dinner in a restaurant and having to run to the shelter suddenly to understand the realities of the Middle East, or to go to the place of the Nova Music Festival in the south of Israel and to see the memorials to 450 youngsters who were murdered there in the most brutal ways. It absolutely makes an impact. So allow me to say something very open, and I'll say it because I'm Israeli. Maybe it's certainly not European, and maybe not even American. But guys, help ELNET. Help ELNET in what you can, because they are doing a wonderful job. I don't work for ELNET. I don't get money from them and anything else. But I see their work from the outside for the past 6 years. And it is so, so important. So guys, if you're here, please take it upon yourself, whether it's $1 or 1,000, help ELNET and you know that everything you invest is going to the good cause. We need your help.
Toda Rabba, thank you so much, Shlomo. And yes, you're right, you're not getting paid for what you say. However, now at least I owe you a drink. So, but before we close, and again, if there are more questions from the audience, I see the number of participants remains strong and stable. So it seems people like, or at least are interested in what we discuss. If you have questions, this is the last opportunity to ask them, or later on via email, of course. Shlomo, just to maybe close the round, the Israel survey is about Europe's perceptions of Israel and the relations between the individual European countries and Israel. But we all know partnership, friendship is never a one-way street, it's a two-way street. So from your perspective, do Israeli politicians, decision makers have a good understanding of these and other European positions and potential changes? And what can we do also as an organization with our amazing and strong team in Israel to also help Israelis to better understand the European perspective so that we can further enhance the strong and prosperous collaboration we have and we have been building over so many years?
Every public relations manager and every communications manager knows that it takes many years to build a reputation that you can lose overnight. I was just watching the other day the CEO of McDonald's eating a burger. And if you haven't seen it, you should, even if you don't eat McDonald's burgers. That is the problem, a similar problem of the European Union in Israel. They are working on their reputation and they are working on their relations with Israeli parliamentarians. But then comes something like European support for UNRWA in Gaza, or accepting former terrorists, or doing giving money to organizations that fight Israel, and it's very easy to lose the goodwill that is built over years. I think this is certainly would be a very good approach to work more in Israel with parliamentarians. I think some work is already done. And again, the best way is to bring people together, get them to sit together, whether it's in Europe or in Israel. And I know that in November, ELNET's going to have a big international event bringing together parliamentarians from so many different countries. And you know what? If you manage to change 10% of these people's opinions, just 10%, you've done a huge amount. Because being familiar, and I have lived a number of years in Europe and also in Brussels, very often anti-Israeli decisions on national or multinational levels, they are approved by a very, very small majority. It's 2 or 3 people who voted this way or the other out of 20 or 30. If you influence the opinions and you manage to get some people to even alter their views, even abstain. Sometimes abstention is okay if you don't want to be tagged as pro-Israeli, but you don't want to be tagged as anti-Israeli. It's these 2 or 3 people in the room in Brussels who make a difference. And I participated in a number of committees that sat all on the issue of educational, academic, and scientific relations with Israel. And you have the usual suspects. I think Humphrey Bogart said that in the famous movie Casablanca, round up the usual suspects. Well, you got the usual suspects who always provide wonderful arguments why not to work with Israeli universities, because they're all reservists and they're in the army and they develop technologies and they do this and that and the other. But at the end of the day, it's 1, 2, 3 people that make the difference. It's people who make politics. I don't think that politics make the people. Sometimes they do in great movements, but it's usually people who make the politics. And ELNET's work here is absolutely crucial. Keep on the good work.
Again, thank you so much. And maybe before we close and hand over to our president, Tom Flash, just to finish, Shlomo, where do you get all your optimism from? What drives you?
I'm 60 years old. I've been through well, depends how you count, but 9 or 11 wars. It depends what you call a war or not. And the only weapon we have is optimism, because when everything looks really bad, you have to be optimistic. But I always tell myself the other side is suffering more than us. I was talking to my mother last night. She lives in Modi'in in Israel. She lives alone. My father died many years ago. She's 81 and she has to run to the shelter all the time. She's unhappy about this. She doesn't want to be woken up at 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning at her age. She doesn't think she needs to run to the shelter. And I say to her, Mom, every time you run to the shelter, remember the other guy gets 10 times that. So it goes back perhaps a little bit to me as a young child. As a child, I spent 2 years in Britain. I went to school in London. And on a number of occasions, especially once that was quite bad, I was beaten up by anti-Semites when going back on Shabbat from synagogue. And they beat me up. I was 13 and they stole my kippah. And I came home and I said, you know, what the hell, this and that happened and so on. And my mom said, yeah, but think about it. In the general view of things, we're here. They tried to kill us and we're still here. So this keeps us going, optimism. We don't have any other weapons. So we have missiles and planes and boats and what have you and guns. But you have to have the optimism. What will you tell a child in Michigan tomorrow? They're completely frightened out of their wits. Someone drove into the synagogue and was shooting and had bombs and so on and so forth. They're not part of the Middle East. They're not used to this kind of stuff. Optimism, because we were here before and we'll be here later. That's the only thing that keeps us going.
Wow, that's a very strong closing. And for sure, Europe could need some more of this Israeli optimism on many levels. And definitely, and that's what the Israel Survey 2025 shows as a longitudinal study from 22 to 25 for four waves in 4 different years. Many European parliamentarians also call for closer cooperation with Israel, maybe because they are looking for some more motivation, for some more optimism that Professor Dr. Shlomo Shpiro shared with us today. Thank you so much, Shlomo. Again, we will catch up later this week here in Berlin. For all of you who are eager to learn more about the Israel survey, please have a look at the global website. The slides will be available for download. And without further ado, dear Tom, the floor is yours. Thank you, everyone. You're on mute, Tom. Tom, you need to unmute yourself, please.
Is that good?
Yeah, now it's good.
Good. You see, I remained optimistic and I prevailed. I was able to unmute myself. Shlomo and Karsten, this was a really, really very inspiring session. And for those who've been on these calls for the last few weeks especially, our numbers of viewers has been soaring, record numbers. And this is just one more in that flow of generating the optimism, the resilience, the survival instinct of why are we so confident that we will succeed? And it's just that ingrained optimism that our people have developed over the thousands of years. So I wanted to say also that I didn't ask the question I was going to, but I didn't. And that is, especially with parliamentary elections, that there is a quest to get elected. And sometimes the means in which they get the votes is not necessarily means to get the right support for the cause. And when you mentioned about the needs for survival, the needs for defense, the common needs from a good relationship between Europe and Israel and freedom democracies in the world, it's really a prevailing thing that I think will keep us together. So I wanted to say this to you. You did a great job, Shlomo, of telling why I feel and we feel ELNET is so important and could not agree more. As a matter of fact, Karsten, you invite me to join you on that drink. I'll try to be there too, and I'll buy. It's great. So Shlomo, thank you so much. It was really, really wonderful. Thank you for your pitch for our ELNET and future. We are focusing a lot on delegations. We're taking delegations because we too feel very confident that the delegations are making great progress. And so we continue to do those, and we're doing those more and more into the future. And so I remain optimistic. All of you remain optimistic. And I mean, it'll be good to see all of you next week again with our next briefing. But thank you so much for this very enlightening and inspiring session.